Great. So, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for part 4, the last part of our Growing St. Louis Co-ops series. This is going to be about conflict resolution in co-ops and how to develop a conflict resolution strategy. We're really excited to see some familiar faces here, some new faces, but I also wanted to highlight that we are debuting our logo today. So if you look at the bottom of the slide, that orange mushroom will be our logo moving forward. We're pretty excited about it. All right. So a little bit about this co-op series. If you have been here before, you've seen this, but if you haven't, I want to talk a little bit about why we are doing this. We want this to be a place where we can do collective learning. All of us at Co-op STL and anyone who's interested in co-ops generally in the St. Louis region all have a lot to learn together. And we want to be a place where we can share what we've learned, new ideas we have, and all be together in this space. We also want it to be a place where we're practicing skills. So I know for myself that conflict resolution, I'm a pretty conflict-avoidant person personally, and I'm trying to work on that. So it's a place where we can really practice these skills that are really important to being in a cooperative. And then lastly, it's a place to really get to know each other and start building the community and ecosystem we want to see with our cooperatives. So we're hoping that this can continue to be a space for all three of these things. A little bit about today. So what we are definitely going to talk about today is what to do before, during, and after a conflict. We are going to talk about some common types of conflict you might see in cooperatives, share some tools for approaching conflict generatively, and explain when you should seek outside help, because sometimes you do need someone with an outside perspective to come out and mediate any conflict you have. What we might do today, we might answer questions. So to get a little bit of practice with this, please go ahead and type your name, pronouns if you wish to share them, and your interest in co-ops in the chat. So we will feel free to come off mute anytime during the session and ask questions. You can also throw your questions in the chat, and we'll definitely try and answer them at the end or as we go through. But if not, we'll definitely make sure that they inform how we talk about our practice session, which is going to be on November 8th. Which comes to what we won't be doing today. We're not going to be doing any specific practice. We'll be focusing on that on the November 8th session. And we're not going to be giving out specific organizational advice. All right, so I'm going to give folks a minute or so to go ahead and throw your name in the chat. Emily did that when we jumped in, so go ahead and follow Emily, and yeah. Hi, Susan. Hi, Aya. Cool to see someone from Chicago here.
Lots of interesting co-op work happening in Chicago, I hear.
And Michael from Oshkosh. Very, very cool. Well, I would be remiss. I did not introduce myself or my other Co-op STL folks. That's like a common issue that I have. So I'll go ahead and do that now, and then we'll go move into the content. So my name is Zandi Barrett. I am with Co-op STL, and I use she, they pronouns, and I'll pass it off to Chris.
Hi, I'm Chris Wilcox, pronouns he, him, with St. Louis Mutual Aid, a Red Circle, and different places. And then go ahead, Jenny.
Hi, I'm Jenny. I am a worker owner at a local co-op in St. Louis called Garrity Tools. We make pottery tools, and I'm an artist and a board member of Solidarity Economy St. Louis.
All right. So some of y'all might know this, but I want to talk a little bit about what is a co-op. So at Co-op STL, we like to define a co-op as a self-governing group of people who voluntarily work together to meet their common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations through a jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise. We use this definition because we want to be pretty broad with what we think about as a co-op. It's not just a worker co-op or a housing co-op. It could be a nonprofit that is directed by the community and by the people who work there. So we really want to have an expansive idea of what can be considered a co-op. We also like to break our co-op definition into kind of 3 general categories. member owned. And when we say something is member owned, we're talking about the financial stake. So it could be, if it's a worker co-op, the capital it's put in up front. If it's a housing co-op, it could be paying down that mortgage. It could also just be putting time, that volunteer time, into the co-op. Member controlled is the decision making. So every member has that equal share in the decision making in the co-op. And then member benefiting. So this is making sure that like whoever the co-op is there not just to exist, it's there to do good for the members and the community. So whether it's a housing co-op having affordable housing or a worker co-op having that profit sharing, we think that these are kind of three core components of a co-op. We also want to introduce and always keep coming back to our cooperative principles and values. Today, we're going to focus on, through conflict resolution, a little bit about education, training, and information, autonomy and independence, democratic member control, and cooperation among cooperatives. So how can conflict infuse through these different principles and values that are core to the cooperative movement? All right, so now for the meat of today. I'm going to go ahead, we're going to use the chat for this. So go ahead and think about a conflict that you've had recently. It doesn't have to be at work or in a cooperative. It could be in your family. It could be with friends. But go ahead in the chat and put on a scale of 1 to 5 how you think it went. 1 is not well, 5 is very well. And we're going to talk a little bit about this. All right, I'm seeing lots of 1s and 4s. I see that's some polarization. It's kind of interesting. Susan or Scott, would one of you mind coming off of mute and you just mentioning one thing that you think made it not go so well? So you don't have to talk in specifics about the conflict, but just like one element that kind of made it not go so well.
Okay, I'll break the ice. This is Scotty. Keeping it simple. Basically, 0 attention span, no movement at all, oblivious to any kind of work plan or any kind of dialogue. The pretense of getting anything done was redonkulous. No players on the field. Okay.
Yeah, that's I think that's a pretty common, like people don't really have that presence in the conflict to be really involved in the stake and the resolution is what I'm hearing from you.
Well, the conflict is about inaction. So let me be clear about that. Just basically getting people to do what they say or do what they claim to want to do and get off their asses. So
Sounds familiar.
okay.
I think I've
Thank you.
experienced that at some point.
Yeah.
Thanks, Scott. And then I'm one of the 4s. So Jenny, Emily, or Aya, can you share one thing that you think made this conflict go well?
I can say mine. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Aya, please.
All right, thanks. I guess I kind of paused and took a moment to kind of collect myself and took a day and just like put my emotions to one side and decided that keeping the relationship civil and going was more important. I looked towards like just resolving it rather than saying everything I wanted to say and having that resolved inside myself.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing that we're going to focus on today as well, is like part of conflict is making sure you have the tools at your disposal. And part of it is also like having that awareness of where you and the other person are. And like, is this the right time to have that conflict? Maybe I need to take some space and come back to it once I've evaluated what I want the resolution to be. So I really appreciate both of you sharing, and we're gonna dive right in.
Yeah, I mean, I think it also just really makes sense that it was all 1 or the other, 1s or 4s, that there weren't any 3s or 2s, because I think normally when we go into conflict, we have strong feelings about it one way or the other because it's conflict. So yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense that that's kind of how it shook out.
Yeah. So when thinking about conflict, I like to come towards it from a generative conflict approach. As I'm working on my own conflict avoidance, I think this is where I really want to ground myself, and this is what we're going to be talking through a little bit today. So a generative conflict approach believes that conflict is going to be an inherent part of our relationships. So we're not going to be conflict free in our lives. And so how can we work with and through conflict? It also believes that conflict can lead us to more creative and productive solutions. So if we have 2, 3, 4 minds coming into a space and they're coming from slightly different places, we might come to something more beautiful at the end than if it was just one of us working through it. It also asks us to lean into the conflict and the discomfort that comes with it. So conflict is not usually comfortable. And so we need to really be working on how do we sit in that moment and work together through it. And then the last kind of element of this is that it seeks to bring us closer together. So through working through the hard parts of conflict, we can build up some of that trust that can help us move through some of the other work that we do. So now I'm going to pass it off to Chris to talk about what to do before a conflict.
Yeah, so just like with everything else, it all comes down to your values in terms of what, because the result in some way is going to be informed by the values that you set forth in your cooperative. And usually the best way to live your values is to plan to live your values. And so that applies to conflict just as much as we've talked about everything else. And so there are certain things that, certain general practices that can be helpful to do before the conflict, because I think, as maybe some folks have alluded to already, that in the heat of conflict, it's difficult to figure out exactly how you should go about it, which is why it's a good idea to think about what's your process going to be for the conflict beforehand, because whatever you try to come up with, in the moment might not be helpful. So one good place to start, I think, is to talk about community agreements. So whenever you're meeting together, or just as a general principle for when you're working together, it can be useful to agree on a set of communication practices to facilitate healthy debate and avoid unwanted escalation. And even talking about conflict avoidance, like actually making a commitment to actually work out conflicts instead of avoiding them can itself be one of these community agreements. And you can, based on how the group works together, you want to come up with particular practices that tend to draw out better resolutions. And this is probably something that you're going to have to work out the finer details as you go along, because even if you have some experience working together, you may not know how you're going to approach any given problem. And so part of how you plan for that is going to formalize the procedures through which you have those conflicts, have specific plans for how to resolve disagreements and avoid exploitation and power imbalances, including grievance termination policy if the conflict can't be resolved. And so power imbalances, for folks who went to the early one, you may remember that I used the example of ACT UP and how the different groups tended to be stratified by race, class, and gender. And one group had more information than the other, which meant they had an inherent advantage and kind of looked down on other parts of the group. They developed different governing philosophies and ended up splitting off entirely. And so, having these procedures in place ahead of time is one way to be mindful of any possible power imbalances or abuses of authority that happen within the organization, so you can avoid having to resort to that part where you may break and the organization may not be able to hold the tension anymore. And this is something you're going to have to want to revisit over time. I think generally when you're talking about what practices you're going to use to work through and resolve conflicts is going to be an iterative process. You're going to set aside plans, you're going to put those plans into practice, you're going to have a result for how that worked out, and you're going to learn some things about how you're going to do it differently based on how this is or isn't working. Any particular program or practice is going to have to be evaluated for it to continue to be effective. We can move on to the next slide. So these are examples of some community agreements. I'm borrowing these from St. Louis Democratic Socialists of America. These are some community agreements that we put into place to try to make sure that conflict is within certain bounds so that it can be generative. And also so that conflict doesn't kind of fester and get untalked about, so that it draws people out to be honest and open about what it is, what is or isn't working for the group. To explain that further, well, for the first part, challenging the behavior and not the person. So some people may have heard of I statements, for example, rather than starting with, you did this wrong. Think about, usually often the sentence construction. It makes me feel X when you Y, and to drill down a little bit further. You want to try to talk about why a person's particular action is something that is a cause of a conflict or something that you're trying to work out, as opposed to making a judgment of the person as a whole. Another word for this often is like a fundamental attribution error, kind of like when you're driving on the road and someone cuts you off and you think that person is an asshole. You don't actually know that person is a bad person, right? But that's a natural response when someone does something that is hurtful or unhelpful, or something that you thought was disrespectful. And so making sure to focus on behaviors and not fundamental judgments of a person as a whole is a helpful place to make sure that conflicts don't go beyond barriers and start breaking boundaries that can be very difficult, if not impossible, to repair in the near term. And so the second example within these agreements is to listen to understand and not just respond. So active listening, right? Not just listening to a part of what someone is saying to benefit you when you make a response, or focusing on a particular thing to make a point, but actually listening to the perspective and trying to understand, especially if this is a source of conflict, if you're trying to understand what is the actual root of the disagreement that you're trying to resolve. So it's really important to remind, something I remind myself often is to actually make sure I'm listening to everything that someone is saying, and not just the parts that I think are going to be useful for the point of view that I'm going to want to get across. The third one is why am I talking, or WAIT as an acronym. So particularly this is referring to making sure that you're talking for a particular purpose. The main reason to keep this in mind is to avoid someone taking up the whole space and taking up the floor. Are you just repeating something that someone else has said? Like, are you talking to listen to yourself talk? Are you making it more difficult for someone to chime in? Which also leads to the last part, is your step up or step back. Like if you find yourself dominating the conversation, if this is something that you notice you're talking a lot and you're maybe not listening, or you are just listening to respond, it's a good thing to remind you to step back. And the reverse is also true. If someone isn't speaking up or isn't voicing a concern, that's something you want to try to draw out people, because people can be on either sides of the spectrum, and the same person can be on different sides of the spectrum depending on the setting or the particular subject of the meeting. And so this is intended to make sure that someone isn't trying to take up all of the time and all of the floor, and to be mindful of when a particular person might be doing that. And also trying to draw out better participation from people who maybe, for instance, might be personally conflict avoidant, and therefore like trying to make it more comfortable, make it a more comfortable and less painful process for that person to bring up concerns in good faith. There we go. Move on to the next part. And so thinking about what your procedures look like. And so this is going to be very different depending on what kind of cooperative it is, what kind of work does it does, how many people does it have, what are the risks involved in the work. You know, as a general rule, organizations that operate in a higher risk environment tend to be more rigid, they tend to be more bureaucratic. In some ways, this is necessary. In some ways, it can be vital, because you want to try in a very complicated environment not to make arbitrary decisions. It can also lead to other problems. You know, rather infamously, if you are in a group that operates via Robert's Rules of Order, they're useful because they establish an absolute correct answer in terms of who is in order, who is out of order, who has the right to speak. The downside is that they can get pretty complicated, they can get frustrating, they can be a barrier for participation. They could also give a power differential to someone who understands the rules better. And so someone may get their way more often because they have a higher mastery of the rules, and not necessarily because they're making the best point or they're doing what's best for everyone. So there's an important balance to keep in mind as to like how rigid, how formalized. I think generally speaking, it's probably better to formalize things more. Whether that leads to a more rigid practice or not is something you're going to learn through experience, which is why this has to be iterative. And I think one last point is that accountability should be tied to authority. I think in a traditional organization, the orders go down from the top. Particularly if you've been on the bottom of that pyramid, often the responsibility can be, authority can be a way to push responsibility onto someone who has less authority. And so when you're trying to make practices different, because you may be in a cooperative that requires some divisions of authority, because not everyone can be paying attention to this particular detail, and referring back to the Darcy exercises we did in some of the earlier ones, different people may have different authorities, and some people may have more authority generally. We want to make sure that they're in some ways accountable. Maybe they can be voted out. Maybe they're elected in the first place. Maybe there are ways of, bringing up grievances and concerns that can resolve these conflicts and make sure that differences in power and authority don't get abused. And I see Scott has their hand raised if you had a question.
Oh, just a quick thing. I would ask you to explain further your intent about talking about iterative process, because I think that's really good and loaded term.
Yeah. So
say more about that.
Yeah, by which I mean you take the results and you take your observations and experiences using the process to inform the process in the future. So you may be pointing out certain ways you plan to hold a meeting, or you plan to resolve a conflict that you thought were going to work that turns out not to work as well as you thought it did. And you might, through experience, learn particular reasons why. Maybe there's an aspect of working with this particular group that you thought, or maybe there were some unspoken rules that you thought were well understood by everyone but weren't. And so what I mean by iterative is something that you're kind of going in a cycle. So, like when you're having any kind of project, you're evaluating at the end, you're trying to figure out what worked, what didn't. You try to pinpoint what particular reasons do you think these things worked and didn't. And you want that to inform your process because you're probably going to run into a similar problem in the future. And so if something didn't work particularly well this way, that it should prompt an action to think about why that is. And maybe you're not going to be able to pinpoint exactly what alternative is going to work, but it's going to tell you that you should try something else. And then when you try it and then you have an experience using it, you're going to evaluate again whether that's the way that you want to continue to do this, whether this is still working. Does that make sense?
Okay.
And hopefully we should have some if you have any particular examples that you'd like to share, that would be a good thing to think about for the practice session, because we could get the opportunity to maybe put this into practice if there is something that, because ultimately you're only going to learn from it by practicing it, right? You can plan, you can and should plan the best you can, but know that whatever the result is going to be is probably going to be at least slightly different from what you expected.
And I think I'll just say too, when it comes to conflict, like in doing that sort of evaluation, I feel like this has come up in a lot of our workshops of like, you can always change things, right? But what's so important, what Chris I feel like is pointing out too, is that ideally before the conflict, right, when you're first figuring out how you're going to operate, you have that system in place of like how we handle conflict, or these sort of procedures. And you also, everyone is on the same page that they can change if we all agree to change them, so that it makes that sort of iterative process just part of it from the beginning. And that also, I think, helps when conflict does get really hard to know, why was this one so hard? Why is this so hard? And to be able to talk about, you know, how to update and make things better for next time.
Yeah, Tommy, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I think my questions are more specific that might be more useful in the like in the practice stage of the workshop and everything, but I just wanted to comment that in response to a number of incidents that had happened and community dynamics that were present during like in my intentional community, I founded like a committee for like social community health, just as like a with the focus on, you know, being able to approach situations like this and try to de-escalate conflicts and also prevent them. But I had questions, you know, as it relates to like how to put in place policies and procedures that kind of deal in like a bit more difficult cases, because I think that difficult in the sense of like it's not necessarily like cut and dried what needs to be done, because what has kind of slowed the process and putting a lot of these like, you know, policies that seem like no brainers, like, you know, no bullying or, you know, no harassment and stuff like that, is people having concerns about people interpreting their behavior as being a very large grievance and then using that against them in a very permanent way, like getting them kicked out of the intentional community or something like that. So being able to talk through like what certain procedures can look like that account for instances like, oh, they have it out for me and so now they're putting in a false claim or whatever like that, could be helpful to give people more confidence that these procedures and policies are meant to protect us and not to be weaponized against each other.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of looking at it. If you it would be really helpful if you put that in the feedback section, so if that's something that you want to explore in more detail in the future. And I think maybe it would be helpful if I kind of looked at an example as well, which I think you already touched on some of those with the one you just brought out. But if I'm thinking about, like, let's say that you have a particular procedure that at the beginning of every meeting, you're going to do a round robin and everyone is going to take turns and say, you know, this is what's working well, or this is a concern that I have. And then maybe say that some people are getting frustrated by this process because they don't feel like they don't always have anything to say. And so maybe you take that into account and you decide that, okay, that part is going to be optional. And maybe you find out later that some problems that were not, you know, being addressed, like maybe someone had an issue with a particular work process, and it's caused arguments in the future. And maybe you learn from that, and maybe you find, okay, what's a good exercise or what's a good rule to set for how meetings go, so that we aren't necessarily putting people on the spot when we don't have to be, but we're also drawing out potential sources of conflict and working them out in a better setting, if that makes any sense.
It does, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So we can go to the next part. Yeah.
Cool. So I think I am taking it from here for a little bit, and to talk a little bit about what to do during conflict. So I'm also just going to say, Tommy, I took some notes while you were talking in a doc that we'll use to kind of plan our practice session. So definitely leave that feedback. But I think, yeah, like Chris was saying, I feel like in our practice session, having some, and what you're asking for, having some examples of those procedures will be really helpful, and how to not like weaponize them, important. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what to do during conflict, and talk through a little bit about conflicts that can come up often in co-ops. As I'm going through this, if you guys have other examples of general kind of like conflicts that you could see being issues in co-ops, or ones that you've experienced in co-ops or other places, feel free to drop them in the chat, because they can also help inform our practice session. But we'll go to the next slide to get started. So kind of common types of conflicts that we'll see come up. And one of the things that I just like to kind of bring some presence to around conflicts within co-ops is that and you know, as Zandi kicked it off, like conflicts are human, they will happen. But particularly in co-ops, it is a more, I would say, like human-centered way to operate your organization, your business, your group. And so it is, I think, really important that we do like have the skills to work through them, and that everyone's sort of prepared for that. So I'm also going to talk about some tools about how to, similar to Chris, sort of preventative tools, or tools that you can put in place to help resolve them a little bit easier. But some of the things, kind of areas of focus for conflicts would be, you know, between roles and responsibilities, financial decision, and strategy and big plans. These are all things that if you have a worker-owned co-op, all of your work owners should be involved in. And so when all those people get involved, there might be differing opinions, which could lead to conflict. So we'll go to the next slide. And all these things were touched on in our previous workshops. So if you weren't able to attend our previous workshops, like Zandi said, they're on YouTube. But a lot of the tools that I'm going to talk about, we also sort of went into more detail at those workshops, so you can watch them to get more information. But in terms of roles and responsibilities, potential conflicts that we see within co-ops, and you also probably see this in many other scenarios, but one person taking on too much responsibility, certain tasks aren't getting completed, there's overlapping roles, and also maybe within those overlapping roles, people have incompatible roles at the same time. So like, I have a good example of this from Garrity Tools. We had, when we were trying to kind of grow our team, one person was in charge of fulfilling orders. So they were shipping out orders, but they were also in charge of telling the production team what they needed to make every week. So there was this brief period where that person was the same person, and they had it was more of an internal conflict, but it became a conflict between our production and them, because they were like, well, I know I have to ship all these orders, but I know I can't push you guys that hard. And like, it was a really hard spot to be in. So having two roles that are kind of incompatible within one person can cause conflict as well. In terms of tools that could help with some of these things, Darcy, which Chris also brought up a little bit earlier, is a kind of project management tool that we talked about, that it kind of outlines these 4 sort of roles within each project or job task. So there's outlining your decision makers, who's accountable for it, who's responsible, consulted, and informed. One of the like really clear things about Darcy is that the accountable is always just one person. And so it's really clear who should be accountable for that. If you have that in place ahead of time before a conflict, when maybe conflict does arise because some tasks aren't getting completed, you can really easily look at your Darcy spreadsheet and say, well, you know, Sam is responsible, is accountable for this. So we need to go to them and ask them about, you know, what's going on here. Clear job descriptions can also be really helpful. So that kind of goes a lot. We use Darcy at Garrity Tools, and we have our job descriptions, and we sort of use those to fill in Darcy, because everything that's in our job descriptions should also be clearly defined in terms of what needs to get done to make our co-op operate. But having really clear job descriptions that have not only just like a general description of the job, but very clear job tasks. We separate ours by like percentage. So it's like a category of mine is like office bookkeeping, basically, and that's like should be about 15% of my job, and then there's like 10 bullet points under that of like everything that entails. It can get you can get really into it, and it can get a little bit much, but it can be really helpful when it comes down to like, for me to understand what I'm doing, for someone else to understand what they're doing, and making sure that we're not overlapping, that things are getting done, and that also to weigh to see when maybe we need to hire someone else, because this person's job description is very long and there's no way they can get all this done. Defining governance and operations. We talked about this a little bit in our membership and governance workshop. So just making sure it's clear if you have a co-op and you have worker owners, but you have a little bit more separation between what your roles and responsibilities are as worker owners versus what your roles are as like team members or kind of operation side. But making sure that's really clear is another just point of conflict that happens, can happen in a co-op, just because sometimes, depending on how you're setting it up, your worker owners are not the people in charge in the day-to-day operation, but they are making big decisions about the company. Making sure everybody's on the same page with that can help. And then decision-making charts. So we talked about that also in our last workshop. Just some really clear ways to, if there is an issue or some conflict arises, to help you get to a solution, and also to be clear about, like, if a decision was made and that's what caused the conflict, to be really clear, like, well, did we follow sort of the, well, I'll call it a procedure that we outlined in our decision-making chart, can help sort of resolve that and maybe prevent it too. Go to our next slide. So another large area of potential conflict, would be financial decisions. It's so funny, even talking about conflict, my body's like a little bit like, so it is such a visceral thing for me. But it's something that I have learned to like in terms of the way it can help us grow. So financial decisions. We've also talked about, just with finances in general, being able to build trust and comfort around talking about money, because this is one that can be particularly hard to work through. But in co-ops, and some of these, again, might apply to anyone, but potential conflict would be like defining pay rates and salaries, creating and approving budgets, patronage decisions. So this is like how you decide to share your profits, and maybe, like, in particular, like what percentage to pay out in patronage and what percentage to retain within the company. And then another one that could come up is like how to handle a deficit. So maybe your books aren't looking great and you're trying to decide where you can cut back in order to keep your co-op operating. And some tools that we've talked about in our past workshops, like I mentioned before, just building trust and comfort around talking about money. And some of that can come by having financial transparency. So doing financial reports, sharing that with your entire team, making sure that everybody sort of has the financial knowledge to understand those reports and really have a good grasp of what's going on. And then participatory budget sort of ties into that budgeting, but that sort of ties into everyone being involved with the finances, not just at the time that there is an issue, but also before there was, when everyone agreed that this was the budget that we were going to try to do together, so that if conflict does arise, everyone sort of like built the boat and they're on it together, rather than a bunch of people on little rafts all on their own trying to figure out a solution. Next slide. Another topic, strategies and big plans. So this would just be kind of like when you're thinking big and, potentially making some big decisions about your co-op. So just general disagreements about the path forward. That might be something small, like, should we hire this new person next year, which also ties into your finances. Or it could be something big, like, do we want to merge with another co-op and become a larger entity? The other big one, just differing opinions about where to focus spending or energy. So that might be more about like the hiring example I gave, but also like if, for us, like at Garrity Tools, do we want to focus our energy on designing a line of plastic tools, even though we make wood tools? And that was a thing that we kept going back and forth about for the last couple of years. And we had to eventually sit down and have a meeting and say, okay, do we want to put energy towards this? Because it caused a lot of kind of funky things. So tools, we kind of have tried to weave in through all of our workshops, just grounding your co-op's values. So being on the same page about your values, and being kind of clear, revisiting those often, but making sure that when you are especially looking at these sort of bigger picture decisions, that they are informed by what your co-op really cares about. And this wasn't totally why we decided not to make plastic tools, but like an example would be like, we decided not to go down the line of, you know, injection molding plastic tools because one of our values is sustainability, and we can't find a good compostable plastic, and wood is much more sustainable. So that was like one of the kind of arguments for stopping that research project. And it helped us kind of avoid conflict. Another tool, just define your decision-making model. So in our last workshop, we talked a lot about sort of different decision-making models like majority, consensus, consent, and that can just help before you get to a conflict, making sure you have a clear way to make those decisions, but also maybe during or after, as you're trying to make decisions around, you know, maybe how to enact this procedure in this case, that you know for sure that everyone has to be on board if you're going to do a consensus, but not in the moment being like, well, I think we should do consensus, because that could, you know, cause a whole nother side of a conflict. And then just some other basic tools like we've talked about is like voting. So some specific sort of tools like fist of 5, rank choice, all these things, like same thing I said before, whether you have them in place before, when you have them in place before, then when conflict does arise, that you have some tools at your disposal to help you make decisions, to kind of decide how to move forward, or decide, you know, when that you need to like bring in outside help. All these tools can kind of help you navigate those kind of rougher waters. Next slide.
So now that we've talked a little bit about what different kinds of conflicts can come up in co-ops, we're going to talk about some things that you can kind of hold and consider when you're leaning into these different conflicts. So the first one is practicing self-awareness. And we heard a little bit about this from Aya earlier, but it's like, how are you feeling in that moment? And understanding, like, is this the right time to deal with the conflict? I know for myself, I tend to either freeze or kind of a flight response. I get really jittery when I'm entering conflict. It's part of my anxiety response to it. And so I know that probably regardless of when I'm actually dealing with that conflict, it's going to come up, but like there might be times when it's too much for me to deal with right now. And so maybe I ask, can we deal with this next week? When I'm really able to be present and in that moment. And then there are also strategies you can use to get yourself out of those fight, flight, freeze responses, so that can kind of channel that energy and give you space to really think through how you want to deal with things. The next is understanding power dynamics. So obviously we live in a racist, sexist, homophobic world, and these power dynamics are going to be coming up in the conflicts that we are dealing with. So really just being aware of how they're coming and showing up in these, and how any formal or informal power relations also might be appearing, is really important, because it gives you a sense of like, if you're really hearing one voice in a conflict, but they have the power in the situation, how are we actually making sure that the conflict is reflective and coming together to a solution that benefits everyone versus benefiting the person who has more power? And the last one is approaching with curiosity. And this can be tricky sometimes, but really just understanding that the other person, especially if we're in a co-op together, we all want the best for our co-op and for ourselves. And so if we're curious about other people's opinions, we can make sure that we incorporate them and really come to a solution that's mutually beneficial, and kind of prevent that prejudgment as well. Just checking the chat and making sure I'm not missing anything. All right. So another thing to think about is sometimes we can't work through a conflict by ourselves. Maybe it's so big, maybe energy is really high, and we just, as an internal organization, can't kind of work through it. So it's good to know that there are always resources, mediators who are trained to work through conflicts with people. Locally in St. Louis, we have the Conflict Resolution Center. They do some neighborhood-based mediation for free, but they also can charge small fees if organizations are working through conflict as well. And then some more national groups that really focus specifically on conflict are the Stoke Collective and SASIC Facilitation. And so these are all organizations that can be really good resources if a conflict is just not solvable by the people in the room at the time. And then lastly, thinking about conflict and harm, and when sometimes, we don't want to dispose of each other, but sometimes relationships do need to have boundaries and have that termination. So conflict doesn't always lead to harm. Sometimes it's an easier conflict where you're just disagreeing on whether you like ice cream or cookies. I don't know. And you can move through that without harm to anyone. But also acknowledging that we're all probably at some point in our lives both going to be the causer of harm and the person that's harmed. And sometimes that can be within the same conflict, or we're just harming each other. And so it's really important that as we move through conflict, we're taking accountability for the harm that we cause, and then also giving ourselves space to heal when we are harmed in those conflicts. And then finally, Chris talked about this earlier, but sometimes harm requires us to set these boundaries and these procedures. And so if we have these pre-established procedures in place, we know when to have a termination or have important boundaries, especially in the cases of abuse or power imbalances. And I highly recommend Adrienne Marie Brown's writings on harm and conflict, because they do a really great job of talking about how we can set these boundaries without canceling each other. I see that, Tommy, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, so this is like I came in a bit late, but I think there's been like at least 2 times you guys have you've brought up like a grievance and termination policy. I wanted to know what exactly a grievance policy looks like what it's supposed to do and what it's for.
Yeah, so that we have a resource list and there is one posted in there. So I'm going to be sharing that out at the end of the workshop. But a little bit of a brief explainer is it essentially gives like set procedures. So let's say there's an active identification of harm by someone, or someone feels that. It's a very clear step-by-step way of who is involved in working through that harm. So maybe you have a group of 5 people who are they know that they're the people that you're going to go to if you have this grievance. And there's a group of them because maybe person A and person B were involved in the harm. So you don't want to go to them. And they can start like a really clear process of moving through. Maybe we need to seek a mediator, but like by this grievance policy is essentially taking that someone identifies harm, how can we move through it? And this, I think, is also a way to get at what you were talking about earlier of people don't want to feel that when someone says that they're being harmed, that it's then like a target at them. If you have a clear procedure, you can, by having that in place, we know that we're not just going to discard people when they harm someone. Like we're going to work through it together. And so that kind of gets rid of some of that fear of being canceled or being thrown away when you are the person who commits harm in a relationship. But yeah, I'll post the resources that has an example of what that looks like.
Thank you.
All right, so on to the last section is a little bit about what to do after conflict. We're coming up on time, so I'm going to go a little bit quickly through this and make sure we have a little bit of time for questions at the end. So what to do after conflict? So hopefully we've come to a resolution at this point. We are all on the same page about how we want to move through after this conflict. A couple things that are really important to do. A debrief. So maybe we've come together for the conflict, we've mediated through. We should check back in with each other again after that and really debrief. Did the process go well for us? Sometimes the process itself can bring up harm or issues. And so that debrief helps us really talk through what can we do better next time? How are people really feeling after the conflict? Following up from that is assessing and updating procedures. So usually that debrief might surface issues with the procedures that we had in place. And then we need to take those issues and those ways we discovered that we need to change things and actually put it into our procedures so we know it for next time. And the last one gets to that knowing how you are feeling in the moment. But often you might come out of a conflict and be like, oh, I really froze today. That is something I commonly feel, or maybe this is the first time I froze in a conflict. But thinking once you know how you're feeling in that conflict specifically, you can identify strategies that can help you move through it the next time. So some of these are organization-wide and some of them are like a more internal approach to conflict. All right, so that is all of our material for today. I am going to go and put 3 links in the chat. One is to our survey, so if you wouldn't mind taking the next 5 minutes to fill that out. One is to our practice session, which will be on November 8th. And that is when we're really going to dig into some of the nitty-gritty pieces of conflict resolution. And the third one is for our resource list. So that's where we have a bunch of resources. There's links to the grievance policy, to some great writings by Adrienne Marie Brown, etc. Yeah, so I am going to give everyone, we're going to do questions, like 1 or 2 questions, and then we'll give the last couple of minutes for the survey.
Are we doing questions live or in the chat?
Either way, if you want to ask it live right now, go for it.
Whichever you're more comfortable with.
Faster talking. This presentation primarily geared to like formed, internalized co-ops and what happens inside them, and the principles applicable to a continuum of hoped for or attempted cooperations in, you know, in your neighborhood and in the community, you know, and extended networks of stakeholders and that sort of thing. And it gets a little more dicey if you're getting into at-large stuff where, you know, you don't have a prior commitment to work together to kind of lean on. So the question goes this way. I've seen a lot of disjuncture between those who might try to be taking an initiative and putting forth a proposal to get something done, and resistance that's not substantive in terms of its intent. Basically, there are people involved who are not into the grunt work and the objective task. They're into a power struggle, and so any initiative that is taken to get something done becomes a threat to their position. And so you have this clash of paradigms and motives. And it also gets to situations where, you know, well, someone may be putting up resistance on term from their personal power structure or motivation, and they don't know what the hell they're talking about. And so some point you have to get to some reckoning with, you know, accurate and inaccurate premises, information, and right and wrong. So that opens a Pandora's box of quandaries. What do you think?
Yeah, that makes me think about, I think you're right, that like a lot of these strategies are for things that are established. And I think partly you can bring some suggested like strategies to that group if it's not formalized yet. But I also think there's an element of if you're in this nascent stage, hopefully you're coming to it with this like common value set and common like idea of where you want to move forward. But if you're not in that like right relationship yet, it might be time to identify who you're, like, you don't want to discard those relationships entirely, but who are you actually like moving in alignment and in right relationship with, and trying to foster like goodwill and continue to build trust with people that you might be in conflict with, but maybe move forward with people that you know are more aligned. I don't know if Chris, you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the most important point, which is the values, right? Like any cooperative has a certain objective and certain values that it has in common. And, you know, if there is a conflict in values, and that's something that may or may not be resolved through discussion, it could mean a difference in like what is the scope and the what is the scope and the objective of this group. And I think at a certain point you do have to consider whether like every member as it's currently constructed is actually shares that values, and whether you do need to make some partings. And maybe it's not personal, or maybe it doesn't have to be. I can think of, you know, I can certainly think of plenty of examples where I just felt like I wasn't getting particularly far in this organization, and maybe I wasn't a good fit for it, and maybe I needed to go someplace where it wasn't fit, and where I did find that there was more common values. So I think figuring out what the actual values are being agreed or disagreed upon, I think, is the very first step. Like, if you're finding that you do have like the same values, but there's some particular other principles down the line where that's the source of the agreement, and I think it's a matter of figuring out to what extent is this tractable, to what extent, like, is this going to should it require certain changes in the way that group is going to operate or the scope of its work, if that makes any sense. And if you'd like to go into further detail, I would encourage you to attend our practice session. Maybe we can spend some time working it out piece by piece, if that's something you're comfortable with.
So we're just past 6:30 actually. So I know that we're wrapping up. So if you have questions that you're still holding on to right now, please put that in that survey, and we want to bring that up at the practice session and really dig into it. But I want to thank you all for coming. This was a really great session, and I appreciate all of your input and your attendance and sharing this space with us. I am going to post the survey one more time in the chat. So please take that with you as you go and fill it out and let us know how we did. And I hope that everyone has a really lovely rest of your evening.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. And in the spirit of generative conflict, if you think that there is something that either we didn't cover or something you would have liked to have covered in more detail, or something that maybe could have been explained better, yeah, please share that in the feedback so that we could not only improve on it for the next time we do this, but also so we can be better informed for the practice session.